A verdict in Florida provokes questions about race, the criminal justice system, and gun rights, and leads the president to weigh in. We'll talk about how the media affects what we think about Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. A sympathetic photograph of a young man accused in the Boston bombings appears on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, a spot usually reserved for pop culture stars. And the magazine's choice sparks an outcry. We'll explore the journalistic impulse behind the decision to publish that image. And a path-breaking figure for women political journalists dies at the age of 92. Helen Thomas asked presidents and press secretaries inconvenient questions for nearly 5 decades, only to be sidelined for her increasingly outspoken views later in life. A look at her career in full. We're bursting at the seams today. Stick around. I'm David Folkenflik of NPR News, and this is Reliable Sources. Protesters marched in cities across the country this weekend in the wake of George Zimmerman's acquittal in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Pundits took sides as though it were a Super Bowl. We'll consider whether the coverage of Trayvon Martin's death and the Zimmerman verdict has illuminated the nation's racial divide or exacerbated it, and what role President Obama's remarks have played. To help us explore that very question, we're joined in Boston by Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar on the Boston public radio station WGBH, and in Tampa, Florida, by Eric Deggans, the media critic for the Tampa Bay Times and author of the book Race Baiter: How the Media Wields Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation. Here in Washington, D.C., we have CNN contributor Ron Brownstein, a columnist and editorial director for National Journal. Ron, the president surprised reporters when he came into the briefing room on Friday. Why did he address the trial, and why did he do it at that time?
You know, it was an extraordinary moment and an extraordinarily personal moment. I think the media coverage has fully reflected the unique and historical nature of this statement. You know, my colleague Ta-Nehisi Coates at The Atlantic in a piece last fall noted a University of Pennsylvania study that showed during President Obama's first 2 years, he talked less about race than any president since John F. Kennedy. So for him to come out and address this in these intensely personal terms, I think was very much an historic moment and reflected, I think, his kind of personal investment. You know, the predicate for this was his remarks earlier that if I had a son, it would look like Trayvon Martin. He took it one step further when he came out on Friday and basically said, I could have been that person 35 years ago.
Eric Deggans to Tampa Bay Times, forgive me. You've written a number of times that you feel that the press does a poor job of writing about issues of race and questions of conflict, except when the nation seems to be in a moment of conflict or a moment of crisis. How is the press done in this circumstance, and how much do you think the president's remarks may influence media coverage going forward?
Well, what we've seen is what we always see, which is in the heat of this verdict, there's been this explosion of commentary about race. What was interesting to me about the trial was that there wasn't much talk about race because there wasn't much evidence that race was involved in how George Zimmerman targeted Trayvon Martin. But the minute the verdict came in, the racial implications of it produced this explosion of coverage. And we saw, I saw personally as a journalist, the mask slip from some people. I got some of the most awful emails from people saying that I should go back to wherever my ancestors came from if I disagreed with the verdict, which I didn't even necessarily do. People assuming that I had a position on the trial because of my race and because I've written a lot about race in media. And now in the wake of Obama talking about his personal experiences, we've had people like Sean Hannity suggest that he identifies with Trayvon Martin because they both smoke pot. And we've had Charles Krauthammer say that Obama has re-racialized the Zimmerman trial. So we've seen an explosion of comments.
Well, I mean, you make an interesting point. The race was not identified throughout the trial as a key element by the two sides, and yet you say it served as a tinder on this discussion that exploded once the verdict was in. Briefly, why do you think that discussion erupted if, as you say, it wasn't a vital element of the trial?
Because I think the implications are that we've had this young African-American male, 17 years old, unarmed, lawfully where he was supposed to be, minding his own business, presumably, who was then embroiled in a conflict with someone who assumed he was up to no good and killed him. And the implications of that person was not convicted of a crime, leads people of color to wonder, I can be in a place, I can be minding my own business, someone can come up to me, we can have a conflict, I can be killed, and then that person doesn't serve any jail time. So even though there's no evidence that he targeted Trayvon because of his race, the implications of what it means for people of color in their intersections with law enforcement and their intersections in daily life is profound for people. And I think that's something that the president was trying to talk about.
Kelly Crossley, you know, we know by now, we can expect by now, we can predict by now how things will break out in certain outlets such as Fox News and MSNBC. But on MSNBC, a very interesting and distinctive role on both sides of the camera played by the Reverend Al Sharpton. You could see him on camera opining about this case and the parties in this case. You could find him off camera being photographed with the mother of Trayvon Martin. What do you make of that dual role, a man both commenting and trying to shape the news in the streets and outside the courthouses?
Well, we've seen this before. I mean, in fact, when Reverend Sharpton was hired by MSNBC, this came up because he was in the middle of doing what he does. He is an activist. He is a professional activist. That's his job. And he's also connected to a lot of high-profile cases. So that's going to continue, as he made clear. And he made clear to the network, and the network said that's okay with them. Well, what I make of it is that I think it's tough when you have a case like this, and I think it muddies the water for a lot of people who would like to see some commentary from someone who is not so clearly identified with the case. I mean, obviously he has some insight that some others can't get because he's close to the family, and that's valuable in one way. But you know, he's got a show where every day he's sort of opining from both sides, and it's a little bit confusing. I just want to take a step back and comment on something that Eric said, and that about race not being identified in the case. I have to say, whether or not it was articulated, it was there the whole time. And I think that what President Obama spoke about was the context by which African Americans understood race to be there the whole time, from the beginning and in the courtroom. And what he asked in his heartfelt comments was, acknowledge our experience. Acknowledge our experience. You don't have to agree with me. You don't, but this is my experience, and acknowledge that it happens a lot.
And Ron Brownstein, briefly, you know, when you think about the president's comments, obviously race not the only issue of gun ownership. How much can the president affect the conversation as it takes place in the media?
Well, look, as he said, there's a limit to how much he can move it. The backdrop for this, David, is we're living through the most profound demographic change in the society since the turn of the 20th century. 37% of the population is now non-white. A majority of the under-18 population is expected to be non-white in this decade. And at the same time, we're having intense racial polarization, not so much on issues about crime, but on the basic role of government. White, non-white voting patterns moving sharply apart. That is a reality we're living with that we don't discuss very much in the media, except at moments like this.
And clearly one the media has to pay textured attention to.